Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to today's presentation. Today, we'll be exploring the nationalist movement in Indo-China. We'll look at its origins, key figures, and the impact it had on the region's history. Let's dive in and discover how this movement shaped the course of Indo-China's future. Let's take a moment to look at the broader picture of how modernization unfolded beyond the traditional narratives. We see that Japan and China played significant roles in shaping different paths toward modernity, each with their unique experiences and responses. Moving on, it's important to understand how societies talked about modernity versus how they looked the part, what I call talking modern and looking modern. Sometimes, appearances can be deceiving, and understanding this distinction helps us grasp the deeper social and cultural shifts taking place. The impact of colonial domination and the various forms of resistance against it is another crucial theme. Colonized societies weren't passive. They resisted in many ways, challenging the structures imposed upon them. As we move toward the end of conflicts, the end of war marked pivotal moments that influenced national identities and future trajectories. Alongside this, the vision of modernization was often idealized. What did societies hope to achieve, and how did these visions shape policies? A significant dilemma faced by colonial powers was the dilemma of colonial education. Should they educate the colonized to produce a compliant workforce, or foster a sense of national identity and resistance? This tension shaped educational policies and societal development. Emerging from the shadow of China, many nations sought to define their own modern identities, carving out unique paths. The idea of the nation and its heroes reflects how national narratives and revered figures played vital roles in forging collective identities. Public health issues, such as hygiene and disease, also spurred everyday acts of resistance. People found ways to challenge the colonial systems even through small acts of defiance. The communist movement, particularly in Vietnam, intertwined with rising Vietnamese nationalism, fueling independence movements and shaping the regional political landscape. A fundamental question was whether colonies should be developed economically. What were the benefits, costs, and moral considerations behind this? In schools, resistance took many forms, from subtle acts of defiance to outright opposition, highlighting the importance of education as a site of cultural struggle. Finally, I want to remind you that all these themes connect back to our core question: how societies navigated the complex process of becoming modern in a colonial and post-colonial context. Now, as we look at the end of the war, we see how it transformed the nation's identity and its heroes. The war's conclusion was a pivotal moment that shaped the future of Vietnam. Moving on, the rise of the communist movement played a crucial role in fostering Vietnamese nationalism. It wasn't just about ideology. It was about uniting people under a common goal of independence and self-determination. Next, we consider the vision of modernization. This was about imagining a future where Vietnam could progress through social, economic, and technological development, often influenced by new ideas from abroad. Religion and anti-colonialism also intertwined, as religious communities became both supporters and opponents of the colonial powers, fueling resistance and shaping cultural identities. Hygiene, disease, and everyday resistance highlight how ordinary people fought back against colonial rule in subtle but meaningful ways, improving health, resisting through daily acts, and asserting their autonomy. Then, we see the dilemma of colonial education, which was both a tool for empowerment and a means of cultural control, creating complex choices for Vietnamese students and leaders alike. Finally, emerging from the shadow of China signifies Vietnam's efforts to assert its own identity and independence, distinct from its powerful neighbor. All these points connect to the broader theme of how Vietnam navigated its path toward sovereignty, balancing tradition, modernity, and external influences. In 1945, Vietnam achieved independence from colonial rule, marking a significant milestone in its history. However, it didn't immediately become a fully established nation. It took about 3 more decades to fully shape the Republic of Vietnam. During this period, nationalism in the region, particularly in Indo-China, grew stronger. This nationalism was deeply rooted in the colonial context, meaning it was a response to foreign domination and a desire for self-determination. Vietnam played a central role in these discussions, serving as one of the most important states in the peninsula. What's important to understand is that it was through the collective efforts of different communities coming together, fighting against colonialism, that Vietnam was able to create the modern state we recognize today. This process reflects the broader themes of national identity and resistance that are key to understanding Vietnam's journey toward independence and sovereignty. Indochina, as you can see, is mainly composed of 3 countries: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These regions have a long history of influence from China, which has shaped their culture, society, and even politics over centuries. Even after these countries gained independence, Vietnam, in particular, continued to follow the Chinese system of government and retained many cultural elements. It's also important to remember that Vietnam was part of the Maritime Silk Route, a vital network that facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods, and people across Asia. This historical connection with China played a significant role in shaping their development and identity. As we explore this further, you'll see how these influences gradually evolved, allowing these nations to emerge from the shadow of China while still carrying its legacy. So, in the years that followed, we see that the Vietnamese people gradually lost their traditional position of power, and French rule started to take over all aspects of life in the country. This period saw the development of a strong nationalist movement, with local people uniting to resist French domination. It all began back in 1858 when French traders first arrived in Vietnam. Over the next few decades, especially by the 1880s, the French had established control over the administrative and political systems in northern Vietnam. Then, after the French-China War in 1887, Vietnam was divided into regions called Tonkin and Annam, both under French control. This marked the formation of what was known as Indo-China, uniting several territories under French rule. This dominance wasn't just political, it also affected Vietnam's economy and military strength. These changes influenced Vietnamese culture, often in ways that challenged traditional practices. As a result, a sense of nationalism grew, fueled by the struggles of different social groups fighting against French control. This resistance was a crucial part of Vietnam's journey toward independence, connecting directly to our broader theme of colonial domination and the fight for self-determination. Let's talk about the construction of a trans-Indochina rail network that was initiated during this period. This network aimed to connect the northern and southern regions of Vietnam and China, which really helped facilitate movement and trade across these areas. At the same time, there was significant infrastructural development in Vietnam's southern regions, particularly in places like Siam, which is now known as Thailand, and the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. These developments played a crucial role in supporting and encouraging business growth throughout the region. Vietnam, during this period, was a major rice exporter. It produced enough rice to export about 2/3 of its total production, and by 1931, it had become the 3rd largest rice exporter in the world. This boom was largely thanks to the improved infrastructure established during French rule, which made the movement of goods much more efficient. Moreover, the presence of military garrisons across the region was also a result of this infrastructure development. Controlling the movement of these military posts was vital for maintaining stability and asserting French authority in the region. And of course, colonies like these were seen as essential sources of natural resources and other important goods. To support this, the French government invested in building canals and drainage systems, especially for irrigation. This allowed larger areas of land to be cultivated, boosting agricultural productivity and resource extraction. So why did the French believe colonies were necessary? Essentially, they saw colonies as vital for resource supply, economic growth, and regional control. These infrastructure projects and developments weren't just about economic benefits, they were also strategic moves to strengthen French influence across Indochina. The colonial economy in Vietnam was primarily centered around rice cultivation and rubber plantations. These industries were mostly owned by the French, with a small Vietnamese elite also involved. To support this sector, the French established rail and port facilities, which helped facilitate the export of these key commodities. Indentured Vietnamese labor was widely used, especially on the rubber plantations, highlighting how colonial powers relied on cheap labor to maximize profits. Interestingly, French rule didn't promote industrialization in Vietnam, which meant that the economy remained focused on resource extraction rather than developing local industries. This situation allowed landlordism to flourish, often at the expense of the broader population's well-being, leading to a decline in the standard of living for many Vietnamese people. However, as the economy developed and more goods became available, the standard of living did see some improvement. This increased demand created a larger market for French businesses, which was a crucial aspect of colonial economic strategy. Despite these developments, it's clear that policies like land reform and infrastructure development were desperately needed for Vietnam's overall progress. Without such reforms, the economy remained heavily dependent on colonial interests, which limited the country's potential for true independence and sustainable growth. So, when we ask whether colonies should be developed, it's important to consider these complex impacts, the economic benefits, but also the social and political costs. French rule in Vietnam brought more than just economic exploration. It also introduced a more modern lifestyle to the local people. However, this modernization often came at the expense of local culture and traditions, which could be damaged or lost in the process. Education was seen as the key to modernizing the Vietnamese people, helping them adapt to new ideas and skills. But here, where it gets complicated, French authorities were unsure about how much education to provide. They wanted to promote progress, but also needed to protect their own interests, especially regarding employment opportunities. To do this, they deliberately limited access to higher education for Vietnamese people, ensuring that not everyone could reach the levels of knowledge that might challenge colonial authority. This created a real dilemma: how to modernize without losing control, and how to balance education with maintaining their dominance. So this slide highlights that complex tension at the heart of colonial education policies, trying to modernize, but also trying to preserve power. So the education that was provided included classes in science, hygiene, and French. However, this education alone wasn't enough to fully embrace modernity. To be seen as truly modern, the Vietnamese also had to look modern outwardly. This was part of a broader strategy to create what was called an Asiatic French, a version of the Vietnamese that was firmly connected to European French ideals. In this perspective, the Vietnamese were often portrayed as primitive and backward. They were seen as capable of manual labor, but not of intellectual reflection or self-governance. They were viewed as skilled copyists, good at imitating Western ideas, but not as inherently creative or innovative. And this ties into the larger theme of how colonial powers constructed identities and perceptions to justify their rule, emphasizing superficial markers of modernity over true independence or intellectual development. In this part of the presentation, I want to highlight how the colonial education system was used as a tool to influence people's values, norms, and perceptions. The goal was to make the Vietnamese believe in the superiority of French civilization while instilling a sense of inferiority about their own culture. This created a kind of master-slave mentality among the people, which was part of a larger struggle, an effort by the colonial powers to control and suppress the desire for independence. Now, interestingly, many Vietnamese faced real difficulties in qualifying for white-collar jobs because of these patriotic feelings. There was a strong belief that the educated had a duty to fight for the good of society, and this sense of responsibility fueled resistance. During the 1920s, students started forming political parties and publishing nationalist journals, like the Annan Student, which became important platforms for expressing their views. Schools, therefore, transformed into battlegrounds, not just educational institutions, but places where political and cultural struggles played out. A notable example is the protest at the Saigon Native Girls' School in 1926. The principal, who was a colonist herself, expelled students in an attempt to suppress their activism. But the government was ultimately forced to reinstate those students, showing how strong the resistance was. What's particularly fascinating is that teachers and students didn't just accept the curriculum passively. There was open opposition at times, and other times, silent resistance. Vietnamese teachers often quietly modified textbooks and criticized the official content, making it harder for the colonial authorities to control what was actually being taught. This kind of subtle resistance was crucial because it kept the spirit of nationalism alive within the educational environment. This slide highlights the contradictions in their so-called civilizing mission. The rat catchers, instead of eradicating the problem, were just clipping tails and releasing the rats back into the streets. Interestingly, some people even started raising rats themselves to earn a bounty. In 1902, the French hired Vietnamese workers and paid them for each rat they caught. Because the sewer work was so dirty and dangerous, these workers soon realized that if they teamed up, they could negotiate a higher bounty. As a result, the French had to scrap the bounty program. Now, this situation led to serious social conflicts, especially since the spread of disease was so rampant. The native quarter was left without modern facilities, and during heavy rains or floods, the streets would overflow. This made the French city look like a source of the plague. Plus, the sewers, which were supposed to help, actually became a transportation network for rats, allowing them to move freely around the city without much trouble. This all shows how the measures taken were often ineffective or even counterproductive, revealing deeper issues in their approach to civilization and public health. On this slide, we see that the second school of thought believed that the Vietnamese needed to learn from the West, but at the same time, they wanted to resist Western domination. Phan Chu Trinh, who lived from 1871 to 1926, had very strong ideas. He was completely opposed to monarchy and instead aimed to establish a democratic republic. On the other hand, Phan Boi Chau, who lived from 1867 to 1940, took a different approach. In 1903, he formed the Revolution Society, or Dai Tan Hoi, with Prince Quang Du as the leader. He also wrote a book called History of the Loss of Vietnam, influenced by the Chinese reformer Liang Qichao. Phan Boi Chau believed that Vietnam first needed to drive out the French and then restore its monarchy. So, while both thinkers wanted to strengthen Vietnam and resist Western influence, their methods and visions differed quite a bit. Ultimately, this slide highlights two contrasting opinions, one pushing for modernization through democracy, and the other emphasizing the importance of preserving traditional Vietnamese values and monarchy to resist Western domination. When Sun Yat-sen overthrew the monarchy in China in 1911, it sparked a wave of revolutionary ideas across Asia. In Vietnam, this inspired the formation of a new organization called the Association for Restoration of Vietnam. Their main goal was to establish a government that combined democracy with a constitutional monarchy, kind of like what was happening in China at the time. Meanwhile, around 1907-08, about 300 Vietnamese students traveled to Japan to get modern education. Their hope was to use this knowledge to drive out the French colonizers and restore the Nguyen dynasty. They looked to Japan for support and even set up a restoration society in Tokyo. But things didn't go as planned. After 1908, Japan shut down the society and sent many of these students, including Phan Boi Chau, into exile in China and Thailand. This story highlights some of the broader ways Asian countries were trying to modernize and regain their sovereignty during this period. Japan and China, in particular, were exploring different paths, whether through revolutionary movements or political reforms, to adapt to the changing world. It's all part of the larger theme of nations striving to modernize while preserving their identity and independence. Now, let's talk about how the fear of communism influenced the United States to intervene in Vietnam, leading to a bitter war from 1965 to 1972. Ultimately, peace was restored in 1974. Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh leading the north and Bao Dai ruling the south. This division sparked conflict, especially after the Bao Dai regime was overthrown by Ngo Dinh Diem. The South eventually united to form the National Liberation Front, or NLF, which fought for unification under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. One of the key moments in Vietnam's fight for independence was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Over 16,000 French soldiers were either killed or captured during that battle. The French command staff, including a general, 16 colonels, and nearly 1,750 officers, were taken prisoner. This defeat marked the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam. Before that, in 1940, Japan occupied Vietnam. The Vietnamese, specifically the Viet Minh, fought against the Japanese occupation. They managed to recapture Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh became the chairman of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in September 1943. Ho Chi Minh, whose name means "he who enlightens," was born in central Vietnam and grew to become a major revolutionary leader. He met with Lenin and other European leaders, and after spending about 30 years in Europe, Thailand, and China, he returned to Vietnam in May 1941. He then became the president of the Vietnam Democratic Republic. Now, during the 1930s, the Great Depression caused widespread unemployment, debt, and rural uprisings in Vietnam. This chaos created a fertile ground for new leadership to emerge, and Ho Chi Minh rose to prominence in 1930. He established the Vietnamese Communist Party, inspired by European communist ideas, which played a vital role in shaping Vietnam's nationalist movement. In summary, Ho Chi Minh's leadership and the Vietnamese nationalist movement became deeply intertwined with the struggle against colonial rule and external influences, setting the stage for Vietnam's ongoing fight for independence and unification. In the 1960s, we see women depicted as young, brave, and dedicated figures. They were portrayed as warriors and workers, embodying strength and resilience. Moving into the 1970s, as the end of the war approached, the image shifted from that of the warrior woman to the worker woman, reflecting the changing roles and perceptions during that time. Although women played no prominent role in public life in Vietnam during this period, the ongoing freedom struggle began to shape a new image of womanhood. It was during this time that historical figures like the Trung sisters, from 39 to 43 CE, became iconic symbols of patriotism and strength. Similarly, Trieu O from the 3rd century CE also emerged as a symbol of heroic womanhood. These figures helped to elevate the idea that women were integral to the nation's identity and heroic history, even if they weren't always visible in public roles. This evolution highlights how the perception of women's roles has been intertwined with Vietnam's broader national history and struggles. On April 30th, 1975, a significant moment in history occurred when the North Liberation Front, or NLF, took control of the presidential palace in Saigon. This event marked the unification of Vietnam under communist control. It was a turning point that signified the end of a long and tumultuous conflict. The United States, despite its efforts, was unable to achieve its original objectives in the Vietnam War. The goal was to prevent the spread of communism and support South Vietnam, but ultimately, those efforts did not succeed. This war was also known as the First Television War, because for the first time, people around the world could see the realities of combat right in their living rooms, which had a profound impact on public opinion and the course of the conflict. So, as we wrap up this section, remember that the end of the Vietnam War was more than just a military victory or defeat. It was a pivotal moment that shaped the history and politics of the region for decades to come. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share these insights with you. Remember, the key points we've discussed highlight the importance of understanding the core concepts and how they connect to the larger picture. By applying these ideas, you can make a meaningful impact in your work and continue to grow. Again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing how you put these concepts into action.